Same thing.
So we're here talking about treating trauma from a depth-oriented perspective. We have Dr. Paul True, myself, Dr. Renee Miller, and Dr. Josh Cohen, and we all approach trauma from a depth-oriented perspective. So we will be talking about that and also talking about EMDR and how we include that in our treatment approach. So, Dr. True, why don't you share a little bit with us about how you approach treating clients who present with trauma?
I get a number of clients who contact me wanting treatment for specific trauma. Something has happened to them recently or within the past few years that they haven't been able to adjust to or integrate. And I find typically that when they come in, as I'm doing the history taking, as I'm doing all their intake material, that there's some indication that there are repeated traumas of various types going on in their world. So that I tend to see the presenting problem, the presenting trauma that they would like to treat in a context of a history of a number of traumatic events that have happened to them. When I say trauma, I'm talking about not simply as it's defined in the DSM, the witnessing of a horrific event or being in an accident or being almost killed, having your life and limb threatened, but more like the traumas that occur to the self, the traumas that occur to the ego, to the evolving self in the child who is in an unconscious relationship to the parents, very dependent upon the parents, and so very vulnerable to the things that the parent will do, themselves being traumatized in their own childhood and forming a self essentially in response to that trauma. Indicators for me when more depth work is necessary, because it's not always the case that that's what's needed for the client, and I'm always concerned with what the client needs. In other words, some traumas may be able to be processed simply as the trauma that they are. But when I'm doing EMDR and I find that there's difficulty in processing, there's only a partial relief when we're focusing on the trauma that they present with. When we have a very, very hard time coming up with the statement of the negative cognition, the central belief that holds the trauma in implicit memory so that it keeps reenacting itself on an unconscious level, so that the client is always bedeviled by the sense of something about ready to get them, something that is dangerous in the world, something that is very clearly unsettling for them, but they can't define it, they can't get hold of it. To me, that seems to be expressed in the relative ineffectiveness of EMDR under those conditions. That's when I would want to go more deeper and find out what else has happened in their life. What are the experiences that made them feel alienated or threatened or ostracized, or any of the number of psychic wounds that we bear as individuals? And I believe that those sorts of wounds are universal. At one time or another, we've all had them. When I'm there, when I see that that's what it is that the client needs, and when we begin to uncover that material, then we're looking very often at complexes, which I think is what underlies the negative cognition, the sense of self in relation to the world that's construed in a negative sort of way. I'm threatened, I'm vulnerable, I'm responsible for all the bad things that happen to me or all the bad things in the world. Those sorts of things are a function of the complexes. as they're defined by Jung. Feeling toned configurations in the unconscious that have a characteristic way of being, so that we naturally flow into them, or they eclipse normal ego functioning at certain times. The person who gets angry on a very slight stimulus and then later on says, I don't know what came over me. Now, that's a very common phrase that a lot of us use. That's sort of indicative of a complex. But Jung points out that the ego itself is a complex. My sense of it is that our ego is formed, our identities are formed by traumatic experiences in the first place. So to come to an understanding of what we are, I think that it's very necessary to go into what traumatic experiences have happened. So that's the way it normally flows for taking a top-down approach in treatment. If the presenting problem will not yield or remit by direct and more or less simplified EMDR treatment, then I'm quite certain, and we'll take the tack that there's more trauma underneath there, deeper trauma, formed into complexes that lie beneath the level of consciousness and are very, very active and very, very troubling. And so then we're in depth work. I believe EMDR is a great adjunct to depth work, and in some ways helps us to speed up the process of depth work. But that's the way it usually works for me.
What about you, Josh?